Good afternoon, Zion. Thank you so much for joining us for the 7th episode of the Safer, Cleaner Planet series. It's a real treat to have you. So first of all, I just want to make a brief introduction. So you are Zion Lights, and you are sort of known really in the environmental and energy community as somewhat of a sort of activist celebrity. And on your own social media, you've described yourself as science communication stargazer, humanist, evidence-based climate action is the way. And you were based in Devon. Now, you have a group called Emergency Reactor. So could you just talk to me a bit about your own way of communicating to the general public and what Emergency Reactor's referring to? And then we can go on to say, ask all the various questions.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. It's great to be here. Emergency Reactor is a climate activist group, but we mostly focus on public engagement. So trying to have conversations with people. We host stalls at events and big cities around the UK, just trying to have a presence and make sure that people understand the evidence base around what we need to do to decarbonize. So this has come out of kind of years of doing very more hardcore activism, to be honest, and realizing that some of it could be quite polarizing, and actually the information side is really lacking. A lot of people care about the issues and they want to do something about it, but they don't understand what actually works. They don't understand what direction we should be going in. So we found really good reception at these events where we just dress up as polar bears and give out bananas and talk about, everything from radiation to, climate data. And yeah, we've done some activism as well. We've hung some banners around London, and we staged a wedding between renewables and nuclear energy at COP26, which went down quite well and was featured in a German documentary. So yeah, it's a climate activist group, but we try to do friendly activism, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Well, you've got tens of thousands of followers, and really you're literally at the coalface of what seems to be a kind of creeping energy political correctness. Now, what you do is educate and you raise awareness around clean energy options, and particularly to break down some of the myths and around what could be deemed to be propaganda, or it's just the way that policy is being perceived in the mainstream media. And particularly what you bring to the table is your own science background and an emphasis on quite detailed statistical analysis, which helps to also compare the options. So often, as you know, one of the reasons I focused on new nuclear, although I want our conversation to be a bit broader than that, is because I feel that a lot of these industries have kind of fallen into their own silos. And I think what's really, really helpful about your work, especially when you're talking to a new generation that doesn't have so many fixed preconceptions about things, is to compare, all the different energy sources and what the pros and cons of each are for people to make their own mind up about where they think it is at. So on that note, if we can just go to the controversy that's around nuclear energy to begin with. Now, there is the issue around bias on certain energy options. Why do you believe that nuclear is one of the best options to address climate and energy security and the cost of living crisis?
Well, I mean, it's not really about what I believe, it's about what the data shows us, which is that the countries that built a lot of nuclear, for example, France, have very cheap electricity for people. This was true before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which, after that, the landscape changed. There was an energy crisis, but before that, they had the cheapest electricity per consumer, whereas Germany had one of the more expensive electricity grids for the consumer. And in terms of decarbonisation, that's just the scientific consensus. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has crunched the numbers on this. They say that there is no way to decarbonise without combination of renewables and nuclear energy. And we're seeing that happen already around the world. It's what France does, what Sweden does. More countries are now making that transition, thankfully. But, I used to be on the other side because I came from an activist background, and essentially environmentalism from an early stage was anti-nuclearism was embedded in the movement because we were anti-weapons. So, the C&D, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and even Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, Sierra Club in America were very concerned about weapons, and they conflated weapons with energy, which I also did from a young age, and over time realized that that's incorrect, that a lot of countries have weapons but not energy. Actually, a lot of countries do that because if they're going to put money into a program, they'll put it into one or the other. So look at North and South Korea, one has weapons, no energy, one has nuclear energy, no weapons. And then obviously there's countries like Britain that have both. So they're not to be conflated really. They're completely different programs. But yeah, when I realized this and I started trying to communicate about it, I realized that a lot of the feelings about it are deeply ingrained. And that largely does come from a fear of weapons, which is understandable, completely understandable. I mean, they're there to be feared. But I came into this work after many years of kind of tiptoeing around the subject. And it was really when I saw the IPCC report in 2018, where it shows the decarbonisation scenarios, and there's 4 pathways in the 1.5 warming report. And all 4 pathways say we need quite a lot more nuclear as well as renewables. So then I saw, someone needs to be talking about this, and it needs to be someone in the movement, which obviously, there's been some backlash, but at the same time, there's been a lot of reception, positive reception, a lot of people actually going, good, I can get behind this. And that's kind of where Emergency Reactor was born, that some people said, well, I want to help, but I don't want to be in any of these groups that are campaigning against the solution. So we ended up setting up this group so that people would have a space to come.
One of the things you're most well known for is for having come out of the Extinction Rebellion. So if you could talk to that experience and the conversion. And also, we obviously met when Oliver Stone hosted a private screening here in London for his documentary Nuclear Now. That was also off the back of the documentary by Michael Schellenberger, which is called Apocalypse Never. Could you talk to your conversion in the context of those 2 documentaries, which have been very high profile, and also how that's helped, in a way, make it less controversial, less of a difficult subject to address?
So for me, I took on this role in Extinction Rebellion after having stepped out of activism for quite a long time. They wanted someone to do the spokesperson work. And I was already doing a lot of public speaking, and I thought if I don't do it, they might have someone do it that's very, negative or not evidence-based. So I thought I could do a good job in that position. And I think I did for the most part of about a year. The turning point for me came when one of the other spokespeople, who's actually a founder of the group, made a claim online, a claim on live TV that 6 billion people are going to die by the end of the century. Now, he'd made this up. There's no doubt about that. He told us he'd made it up. It was a back of the envelope calculation. And he felt that it was justified because it was about waking people up and making them alert and scaring them. And in this interview on the Andrew Neil show, which was broadcast live, millions of people saw it, he basically wanted me to defend it. He asked me about this figure, and I was unable to defend it because I felt that it was wrong. And what he didn't know, and what all the viewers at home didn't know, was that I had been having this internal battle with a lot of the scientists in Extinction Rebellion saying, we need to retract that because we lose credibility. And it's not the best tactic. There are real and scary things that are going to happen or that are already happening that we should focus on. They didn't retract it in the end. They just didn't. They decided that most of the activists felt that it was justified because if it helped wake people up, then it's justified. Whereas I think we really need to be careful about things like that. And we lost a lot of trust over that specifically. And that was where I then stepped back, because I felt that this often happens in this movement, that people's feelings take over, and we won't attain the change we want unless we're using data, unless we're looking at what works, what the evidence is, and replicating that. So I was completely new to the other side of the fence. It was actually Michael Schellenberger that kind of, he saw this interview and he wrote a not very nice article about me, and it had AOC in it and Greta Thunberg, and it basically said that we're doomerists and we scare everybody. And I got in touch with him and I said, actually, that's not true. If you rewatch that interview, I didn't defend that claim about 6 billion people. Yes, okay, I didn't say it was outright wrong, but that's because I felt as a spokesperson that I couldn't go against the group's values, but I did leave after that. So actually, it was quite interesting because he said, well, you environmentalists are all the same. You all hate nuclear too. Now, obviously, Michael Schellenberger has done a lot of work in this space for years, but I didn't know who he was before he wrote this article about me. He didn't have much of a presence in Britain at that time. And so we had this heated argument in which I said, well, actually, I'm for nuclear energy. I know that we need it. And he was completely gobsmacked and said, would you say that publicly? And I said, well, yeah, actually, I've been thinking that it probably is time to say it publicly because I've been saying it to my peers and not making much headway. And now I'm on my own again. I've stepped out of Extinction Rebellion. It's the same issue that they're not representing data accurately. They're not doing it, with bad intent, but I actually do think that it destroys the entire credibility that this movement has. And it destroys credibility just broadly, because then people will say, oh, these climate scientists, they make things up. And I'll say, wait a minute, you need to distinguish between the activists and the climate scientists. Climate scientists, for example, aren't saying that we're doomed and that we have 11 years to live. That's activists. But people have started to, this has become very muddied now. So,
But did you get attacked? I mean, what kind of negative feelings?
Absolutely.
What was the worst things that you had to go through? Because now it seems like a bit easier.
So the worst thing was that Extinction Rebellion, immediately after I then wrote in two national newspapers after that Andrew Neil interview, because I had so much hate mail, really nasty stuff, some racist stuff. A lot of people saw that interview and they saw me as a representative of a group that lies. And I felt that it was deeply unjust because I was not defending this line. If you rewatch it, I deliberately don't defend it, but it was a very difficult position that I was put in when the group had just decided that they were backing that, although it was still kind of a discussion at that time. Anyway, so I wrote these two articles to clarify, actually, I do think it's wrong. It is a made up number. Also, look now, all the hyper focus is on this ridiculous number. We should be talking about how many people are going to die. If people are going to die, all that's bad. Let's do something about climate change. That was kind of my take. But I did also put in there that, look, we need to put nuclear on the table. This is a massive mistake that environmentalists have made for a long time. And we need to kind of recognize that if we hadn't done that decades ago, we might not even, climate change wouldn't be as bad as it is now.
So can you just talk to when that was exactly and where we are today in terms of timeframes?
So that was during the pandemic.
Oh, really? So only 2 or 3 years ago?
Yeah. And so I wrote those articles and then Extinction Rebellion put out a statement. And what was really heartbreaking about that was I know the people that wrote it because I used to help them write press releases in the media messaging team. So I know that they sat down and they wrote this and they basically said, don't platform Ziad, which also, by the way, there's not many people of color in this movement to say that about me just because they disagree with something I've said, not because it's inaccurate, but because they disagree. That was very hurtful. I don't think anybody paid any attention to it, but I did have a couple of there was a magazine that I'd done a lot of favors for. I'd written a lot of free articles for, and the editor wrote to me saying, now you're a nuclear shill and we're cancelling you, basically. You're not writing for us and you're not speaking at our keynote event this year. And that was very upsetting, but I still felt that I'd done the right thing, essentially. And in a way, I thought maybe I shouldn't be allied with people who will turn on you anyway when you correct them when they're wrong, So
where are we now in terms of the attitudes of post these documentaries? I mean, you've been doing what I describe, you, Michael Schellenberger, Oliver Stone, and others in the nuclear industry itself have been doing the heavy lifting, is the way I would put it. And so do you feel that there's progress made in terms of just perceptions?
They've been chipping away at that for a long time. But what I would say is it was very much in an echo chamber of people who were supporting it, and that messaging hadn't reached me. Your ordinary kind of person, environmentalist. I think Michael Schellenberger's impact has been huge in America. It hadn't really reached over here, and so creating that stage here, and then it somehow spread through Europe and even randomly Australia, where I was then invited to speak. That helped to push it a little bit more. But I remember Michael once said to me that he had the scars on his back from this work. And I think, and having experienced some of that, I think it's true. The difference was for me, when it happened to him, he kind of stepped out of that movement, and he, now him and the environmental movement are loggerheads ever since. But for me, I kind of said, I earned my stripes in this movement and I am still an environmentalist. I'm just an evidence-based one, which is why I founded the group. But also, I have earned my stripes. No one gets to say that I don't have an opinion here. I was arrested protesting coal in my early 20s. I was arrested again for protesting tar sands. I've been there and done that. So the young people now saying, your generation didn't do anything. Actually, I did everything. I wrote a book on low carbon living. I did everything. What I'm saying is that maybe there is a better different way of doing things. And actually, a lot of it is about public information. Once people have that information, they make different choices, which is why things like Oliver Stone's documentary so important, because it just lays it out. It doesn't have to be overly emotional. Here's what you need to know. And you know, how long have we waited for a documentary like that? It's desperately needed.
Exactly. So just to people who haven't seen the film, the documentary, either Michael's or Oliver's, the things it touches on, if you could just summarize some of the points. So one is on the nuclear accidents that people attribute to why nuclear shouldn't be supported. And they tend to be a slightly older generation who remember it in their consciousness and from the news. So that's obviously the Chernobyl accident, the Fukushima accident, and earlier on the one at 3 Mile Island. So if you could talk to that, and also the changing attitudes on the issue of nuclear safety and nuclear waste. You've spoken about that a lot. And then we will talk a bit about the difference between renewables and the case for renewables and the case for other alternative energy sources versus nuclear for baseload power, which is an area that you really dig deep on and educate on.
Yeah, so nuclear now does cover, kind of how we got here, where those fears came from, where the misconceptions are, and then it moves through that the mistakes that movement made to where we are now, the seriousness of climate change to where we are now, which is actually kind of leaps ahead, doesn't it? It looks at advanced technology and it goes quite into depth on the shifting sands around what's happening with nuclear and what the battle for the next technology will be, which is all these competing kind of SMR companies. I think it lays a really good foundation for people with quite a low knowledge base anyway. Obviously, I went into it fairly knowledgeable, but equally, that kind of documentary for me a decade ago would have made a huge difference. A decade ago, there was no information. There was not Michael Schellenberger's Apocalypse. Never. There was a deficit of information. There's a lot more information now, and a lot more around the world, I would say. There's been a documentary in Australia. I was featured in that. There was one in Germany. And the important thing, though, I think, is that they're not just about nuclear. So some of those documentaries that I've been in have been climate-based. They've been about climate change, but they now put nuclear in there. Nuclear has a seat at the table for the first time in many of these instances. And that's really important because people need to understand where the fears come from so that they can address their own fears. And this is what we find when we hand out bananas on stalls. Hand out a banana, it's like a free banana, it's radioactive. And you'd be surprised at people's responses. They kind of drop. I've had one guy who literally dropped it and jumped back, and then he just started laughing because he knew that there was something that he didn't understand. And I said, well, actually, you're surrounded by radiation. And he was like, okay, yeah, give me the information. And he was really well receptive to it and said, yeah, you're right. Highly unlikely that I'll ever be exposed to a huge amount of radiation. Some radiation's actually healthy for us, keeps us alive. But something like air pollution, yeah, we're all exposed to that invisible killer. Why aren't we afraid of that? Why aren't we doing something about that? And by the way, nuclear and, as you said, renewables are the options for cleaning up our air tips for better air quality.
Yeah, that reminds me of the story that when we were at the CERN event recently, that Wade Allison was talking about, which was when Elizabeth I in the 1950s is it Hartwell? Was given a plastic bag full of plutonium, which was warm. And it's these sort of things. So could you talk to the points, first of all, what your view of those 3 major nuclear accidents is, just briefly, and then the issue of the safety part. Most people think radiation is going to kill us, and waste is an impossible thing to deal with in the long run.
So the 3, you're thinking of Chernobyl, Fukushima, and 3 Mile Island? Okay, so the first thing that everyone needs to know is that even combined, all of these disasters are absolutely nothing compared with fossil fuel disasters, in terms of death toll, in terms of health impact. We'll get into that in a minute. But Fukushima, 2011, Fukushima Daiichi power plant melted down. It was hit by, so it was a worst case scenario. It's hit by a tsunami and an earthquake, right? Earthquake triggered the tsunami. They evacuate the area. They're kind of over the top. They panic and they evacuate. Turned out that studies later found they evacuated far more people than they needed to. But okay, they were trying to be cautious. But the main thing is they kind of panicked, and they were panicking because there's a tsunami. It's serious business. But the power plant melted down, but it didn't harm anyone. There are no deaths related to that meltdown. That's a really important point, because even when it happened, I remember it happened when it happened and I was reading about it and hearing about it. In my mind, I thought lots of people had died. Actually, those many thousands of deaths were because of the tsunami and the earthquake, not related to the power plant. The biggest consequence of that power plant shutdown was that then so many nuclear reactors around the world were shut down. So as a direct consequence, Japan shut a lot of theirs, although they've now U-turned on that and they're reopening them because they've calmed down and realized more people die from lack of electricity than anything else. And Germany then immediately announced, we are going to close all of our power plants. They had 11 nuclear power plants. We are going to phase them out. It's going to be called Energiewende. It means we're going to be reliant only on wind and solar. And how has that panned out? Over a decade later, they're now just recently reopened their mothballed coal-fired power stations, which is really sad because their emissions would just go up. And they made that decision out of, there's not going to be a tsunami in Germany. They made that fear, it was a fear-based decision that the Green-led government made. They also made a mistake of relying on oil, getting into bed with Putin, and then all of that got shut down because of what happened there. So, we all experienced an awful winter crisis, which actually I think for the first time probably people started thinking, this is what it's like to ration. In Germany where they're rationing electricity, or here where it's very expensive. Yeah.
Because you obviously come from the Green side and Extinction Rebellion, the German dilemma that they're in right now is I think one of the most important topics in the energy sector, because it's an example of what happens when you do take nuclear off the table, and their industry is struggling. I think there's a lot of disenfranchised people who initially were well-intentioned about taking it off, but actually now regret it. What's from having been from the Green side, Scholz's position? What's your observations about Germany today, and what do you think really needs to be done as a matter of emergency? Well,
the truth is, it's too late. They've shut their power plants. That's where are the workers? The workers have gone to France, where there are jobs. They've shut them. They're not. You can't restart them. You can restart the coal-fired power stations. That's still difficult, but it's possible. The nuclear power stations are now just gone. That's it.
But they can not put them back on the table?
They'd have to. So what I've heard is that there are the two final reactors could potentially be refueled. But as I say, the workforce is gone. This workforce is not just there like you advertise a job. This is how many years they have PhDs. They have 7 years of expertise working those jobs, putting food. I spoke to some of them when I went over there at the time of the shutdown, putting food on the table with these jobs, and then suddenly their entire careers are gone. They have to go and find work somewhere else now. It's a high level of expertise lost. I don't even know how you'd convince them to come back when they don't know that those jobs would have any security given the back and forth. But even if they open those 2 reactors, it's such a low amount now of, that you have to appreciate how much electricity they took off the table by shutting them, and also shutting their other baseload, which was coal, which I agree with, but not without replacing it first. That was the biggest mistake they made. They thought, put trillions into renewables, it'll replace it. Well, that didn't work, did it? It doesn't work anywhere in the world. It's never worked. You have to have baseload. So really, they need a new program. They need a new drive to bring in workers. They need to assure people of jobs, and they need to build new reactors. I don't see it happening anytime soon.
So what would you say to those who are advocates of renewables and batteries in the UK and sort of are kind of conveniently forgetting what's happening in Germany right now? What are the statistics that you usually use when people in the UK say, we're still on board for renewables and batteries to solve the crisis?
No large industrial nation in the world has been able to decarbonize with only renewables unless they have a huge amount of hydropower. So those countries that are blessed with a lot of hydropower, because obviously it's geographically dependent, Norway, Sweden, they have been able to do it with hydropower. However, they have also still have nuclear programs. Nowhere has been able to do it without. We have a case study now. Before, 10 years ago, I myself would have said, well, nowhere's really put the money into it, so we can't say that. Well, we've seen that happen with Germany. They did put the money into it. They did build a lot of wind turbines and solar. And, it's great, brought the cost down for everybody, but it was not sufficient. You cannot do it without baseload. Now, there are batteries. Australia's building batteries. So Australia is following in Germany's footsteps. So Australia has a ban on nuclear energy. even though they have a weapon. They're in the weapons program with the UK now, AUKUS. But they don't want energy, so they're trying to just build wind and solar. They're trying to create a huge connected grid, because basically what they've said is it's always sunny somewhere, so we'll transfer it. It's not as simple as that, but that's what they've said. This is a lot of wires and poles. This is going to be far more expensive than any nuclear program, by the way. But they're trying that, and they're also building the batteries. Now, the batteries, again, they cost billions. I'm not against building the storage for batteries, but if you look into this, the batteries only store electricity for 3 to 4 hours. That's how good the storage is. That's the technology. That is just basic physics. If there was better technology, then I would advocate for it and say, yeah, we could do this. But it will fail. 100% it will fail.
And what do you think about the carbon footprint, if anything, of wind and solar in particular, as compared with what SMRs might offer? They
do have a high carbon footprint, and they also, because they require a lot of materials, they need replacing every 20 to 25 years. And they require a lot of land as well. They require a lot of space. But I wouldn't say don't build them. I'm not in that camp. Like, the scientific consensus is build all the clean energy. Don't pit clean energy against each other. Pit it against fossil fuels, because fossil fuels still have a far greater impact, far more resources, far more space. So, my take is just build it all, but make sure you have the base load in place, because otherwise you're just going to end up going back to coal like Germany's done. But I didn't finish answering the question about the disasters.
Yes, go back to that. Yes, Chernobyl.
So Chernobyl was, a lot of lessons were learned from Chernobyl, but it was a very insular case, a very unusual case, because what happened is the Soviet Union had their own reactor, right? They had this RBMK reactor, and they wanted this to be the world's best reactor. And it was deeply flawed. Like, it was known in engineering circles that it was flawed because it didn't have the containment that reactors normally have, which meant that it was capable of exploding. Now, a regular reactor cannot explode. It might melt down, but it won't explode. It's actually the explosion that caused a huge problem in Chernobyl. What happened is, first of all, they were running tests that were not recommended. They were kind of pushing the limits of the reactor. So this was a bad idea. Then after it exploded, they didn't tell anybody. They covered it up as long as they could. In fact, they brought more people onto site to try and fix this problem when there was no reactor to fix. It was just spewing out radiation. They should have cleared that area immediately. They should have alerted everybody immediately. They didn't. Again, they tried to cover it up. So it was mismanaged. It was used poorly from the start because they were testing its limits for some reason. And then on top of that, it exploded, and now the only RBMKs that still exist in that part of the world have all been upgraded so that they can't explode. So that could have been done at any point. So this was a flawed reactor design that isn't built anymore anywhere. It's just not. It's not. Nobody wants it. It's bad technology. It was mismanaged. Now, this can't happen either. We have, because of this happening and 3 Mile Island, we have very strict standards now around the world, like almost too strict, I would say, where there's a lot of monitoring, there's a lot of watching what goes on in these power plants. You've got the UN body, the IAEA, who go in and look at how things are managed and make sure the workers are okay, are they doing things sensibly? These are very,
and do you
jobs.
Put a lot of trust in Rafael Grossi's and
Absolutely.
The International Atomic Energy Agency?
Brilliant.
Well, have you seen that work in because they're obviously dealing with the Ukraine plants to oversee the issues there. But how you've personally observed them in operation with regards to development of new plants?
With the IAEA?
Yes. I mean, why would you put trust in them?
Well, they don't build anything. What they do is they oversee. So when you decide to have a nuclear program, you sign the non-proliferation treaty. So it's really important. And you're basically saying, I'm going to use atoms for peace. That's kind of how they frame it. Then the IAEA goes in and makes sure that that's what you're doing. And I mean, they have all the tools for doing this. What is the program? What is the country up to? They know all of this is happening. I think this is really important, and people don't realize how much work they do actually in making sure this is used for peaceful purposes. They go in and they oversee what's happening. And Grossi has a really good relationship with all these different leaders around the world, looking at what their programs are, and including with countries like Germany where they no longer have a program. He still goes in and does the work. And I think it's basically what I do on a much larger scale, because that outreach is essential. And I think, the IAEA is there for that. But additionally, Grossi has brought something new to it since he took on that role, because he's very, very visible and he's very prominent. And even at COP, the COP's traditionally didn't really have a space for nuclear. In fact, it was really weird. You'd go to COP and you wouldn't see or hear the word nuclear anyway, even from countries that have a lot of nuclear. I think it was like a dirty word and people didn't go there. Whereas now there's a whole zone which the IAEA set up.
They're calling it nuclear for net zero, aren't they?
Yeah, it's one of their kind of hashtags. And they'll have speakers, they'll have climate scientists, and they'll kind of draw people in. That's what's really important, is getting out of the echo chamber and saying, we actually do this work. Because a lot of people's fears around nuclear are things like, well, who's keeping an eye on it? Is it safe? Well, these people go in and make sure. And I mean, if anyone saw that footage of when it all kicked off in Ukraine, they went straight there. I mean, this, I would say this is almost out of their remit, to go into a war zone. But they went there. Are the workers okay? Can we speak to people and make sure that they're getting food and water? They're overworked. Can they go home? What's happening on the ground? Again, we can measure these things. We can measure radiation levels from here. We don't have to be over there. But I do think that human presence is really important. And I have met him, and he is a very straightforward, very clear person. I've got a lot of respect for him. And also, I don't know if you saw this, but I think it was COP26. He got heckled for saying that nuclear was clean. He got heckled by someone in the audience. I thought this clip went viral. But again, that took it out of the echo chamber. But he's very good at, he didn't get cross. He wasn't mean. This person was rude in the audience. And he just said, well, I don't know why you're heckling. This is what the science is. And I hope you'll come around. I thought that was a really brilliant way of dealing with it, when it was actually just so disrespectful. And that's how much the conversation has changed now. I mean, I do think it's a shame, and I always call this out when people finger point at, those countries, look at India and China and the UAE and that part of the world. How can they be, they're oil-rich nations, or they've got coal plants? How can they say anything? It's just ridiculous. I mean, the UK uses coal. What excuse do we have? We drove climate change. Our high quality of life is a direct consequence of development and burning lots of fossil fuels. If you look over at what's happening in these oil-rich and fossil fuel-rich nations, even India and China, yes, they have a lot of coal-fired power stations, but they're building nuclear programs too. Even India, even though they don't really have the wealth to do it, they have an indigenous reactor that just recently came online. They're really trying to decarbonize, whereas we have kind of just stopped. We've some reason we haven't managed to do it. Some parts of the West have, obviously France, Sweden, but in Britain we haven't. We've just completely stalled. So the UAE, they're an oil-rich nation. Why do they need to decarbonize? You could make a strong argument for saying they don't have to, I think. So the fact that they've got the leader there, the Sheikh, has said, no, actually, we are going to set a net zero target and we're going to meet it. I think that's really brilliant, and we should celebrate that. They then went and commissioned a report. What's the best way to do it? And the report came out and said, build a lot of nuclear. You can have some renewables, but put most of your money into nuclear. That was what their independent report said. And I think that's really interesting that they could just go ahead and do that. This is a country that doesn't have the history of the environmental movement that we have and America has, where there's been a lot of pushback, lots of misinformation. They don't have that there. They're literally just like, how do we get off of fossil fuels? So this report came out and said that. And they said, okay, basically we have no industry. We have no nuclear workers. We have no expertise. But we're going to do it. So they opened a bidding process. Who's going to come in and help us make these reactors? South Korea won that. South Korea came in, literally sent over a bunch of workers to train people, sent over people from the industry to set up an industry. Now, in under a decade, they went from having no industry or workers to now having functional power plants that meet 25% of the UAE's electricity.
Is it really that much? And they did that in a 10-year period, did they?
Yes, but the building didn't start until halfway.
Wow.
So in under 5 years, I mean, come on. And now they've kind of gone, oh, this has worked. We can do this again. We now have the expertise, so it's going to cost less. And also you've got Jordan and Egypt asking, this has been in the news, saying we want a program, or at least to import that electricity. So they're understanding how important that is. And the other thing I would say, a great equalizer in some ways, because there's some issues in that part of the world. Yes, I know that. But for example, they've got a lot of women working in these plants, and they're very proud of it. They're very proud of what this represents. And again, that's where the IE comes in and can kind of help build those bridges. And I think it's good for human progress generally, even outside of what it provides electricity wise. So there's a case study of how quickly and efficiently it can be done and how many benefits it can have for the climate and for people as well.
Yes, because I think that they did it on time and on budget, did they not?
They
Which
did.
is quite rare.
And Yeah, I mean, South Korea's done that too, but it was South Korea that came in and sold them their reactors, so it makes sense.
But they were relying on a lot of the international community as well, the nuclear industry.
And that's good. But
British expertise, good. I think, as well, and from Canada.
Yep.
So it was a collaborative effort, was it?
And it should be collaborative.
And is that how we envisage it happening for Great British Nuclear? Is that how you perceive that for here?
Well, it's supposed to be. I think we're not very good at collaborating at the moment. We had Wilfer. We had the site at Wilfer in Wales fall through a couple of years ago. We had Hitachi coming in saying they would build a plant there. The government didn't put the money. They pulled out. I've been there and I've spoken to the workers. There's an entire kind of area of Wales, North Wales, where the entire community's livelihoods were built around that plant because it provided all the jobs. There is no other industry there. And when I went to speak to people, they were just heartbroken because they said, now there are no jobs for our kids. All our kids are going to London. They're not staying in Wales. This area will become very deprived as the plant is decommissioned. It's being decommissioned because it's very old, but there is space and I've been to see it. It's right on the coast. Nobody even lives out there. It's an hour from where people live. The community wants it. The community desperately wants it because they don't have these fears. They worked around these areas their whole lives. I wrote an article about this on my Substack with some quotes from these people because I felt actually their voices, the workers' voices aren't being heard.
And do you think that's replicated in other sites as well?
If that collaboration had come in, that it would be game changing both for the community and for the UK broadly in terms of that meeting our carbon targets. Polls show, the data shows, people who live around these areas are like the most pro-nuclear people not just in Britain, across Europe, America as well, because they don't have the fear because they've been exposed to it. They've often know someone who's worked in the industry or they themselves have worked, even if they're just working as a cleaner or something, it just normalizes it, right? Nobody's getting sick from radiation, for example. In fact, coal-fired power stations emit more radiation than nuclear power stations. So, though I find they're the most pro communities, but it's largely because of jobs.
Yes, and they're the highest paid, aren't they?
Yeah, well, they're unionized. They're good jobs. They're high paid. They're unionized. They're good working hours, high level of expertise. And when I spoke to people there, a lot of them said they did start out on the bottom and the industry gave them a lot of training. They had specific training programs. So it enabled people without many opportunities in that part of the world. And there are a lot of these deprived areas, especially around Britain, especially coastal areas, which is where the power plants go. And they were able to break out of, just quite menial work and not earning much. And that was, again, I wrote about this and just some quotes from them where they just said it was life-changing and they didn't understand why they couldn't get a new reactor. But actually in Wales, there is support across all the parties in the government, Welsh government, for another reactor there, all the parties there. And they have written an open letter to the UK government begging them to get something built there. And I think it's really sad that, Britain, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, now can't build reactors. We split the atom. Ernest Rutherford split the atom here. We can't build reactors. We can't build housing or railways. What's happened to us? This is the lifeblood of our people, So I really feel for the workers actually. And I think you can measure the well-being of a society by those workers, by the engineers and the people that build stuff. It's all very well me going out and saying we should build it, but I'm not the hands on the deck, right? I rely on these people to be able to make MRI machines for us, right? We both do, to make glasses for us. It's that technology that's always driven us forward. So I absolutely am on their side and fully support them and the unions in this. But whether or not these reactors will get built is another question.
So that brings me on to the issue of the political. I know you don't want to get too drawn on politics, but people don't know actually that Ed Miliband is a supporter of nuclear. I just was interviewing Simon Bowen, who's the chairman of Great British Nuclear, and he had a meeting with Andrew Bowie, who's obviously the current Conservative Minister for Nuclear. So I've sensed from you a bit of frustration that you feel that the UK isn't going far enough, and it's very interesting because I obviously read some of your articles, and you're being much more bold openly than other people. Perhaps that's because you are more on the activist side, and so you're looking at it from the outside rather than inside the industry. But you are advocating for a 70% hike in the use of nuclear, and I would like you to talk to that as opposed to what the current government target is, which is 25% from nuclear. So could you talk to the merits of your argument for that? And just address that one first.
So that was, I won't say it's entirely data-driven because there are different decarbonisation scenarios, but they all require at least a doubling of our current generation. So I've gone with 70 because I think that allows a bit of a buffer as well. Look, there's no such thing as too much energy, right? This is a lie that we have been sold, that I myself used to tell in the environmental movement, using energy is bad, switch off your lights. Okay, fine, we shouldn't waste energy, but I don't think anybody's doing that. It's expensive to do that anyway. Actually, we are a very energy-rich country. We're a very, very energy-rich world. We don't know what technology is around the corner. Probably AI, right? AI is very energy-intensive. We don't know what is around the corner that will actually increase our need for electricity. So I think we should plan for more rather than saying, oh, well, we're all, reduce it. We're not reducing. If you're having an electric vehicle transition, that is more electricity from the grid than before. We are not reducing. We are electrifying everything. This is good. But at the moment, our grid is very dirty, 60% fossil fuels.
So do you think the renewables sort of with that being a dominant feature, would that lead to a degrowth agenda? Is that one of the things you're saying, or not necessarily?
I think it's okay. I think we can have it from renewables too. I just don't think renewables can supply as much as people hope. As I say, Australia's trying it. Germany tried it and failed. What makes us different? We've got to look at the evidence of what has worked. That's very clear. What's needed to decarbonize is very clear, and I think we just need to go ahead with it. Imagine if we had all decarbonized like France did in the 80s. Again, a 10-year nuclear program, 10 to 12-year nuclear program, built 58 reactors, fully decarbonized since then. And what have we been doing? And the problem Britain specifically has is a lot of our old reactors are shutting down because they're old and they're being decommissioned. So at the moment, we're not replacing that. When Hinkley eventually comes online and Sizewell C comes on, well, if Sizewell C gets built, that will replace that generation. That is not adding anything. So where is this 25% coming from? It's just pulling numbers out the air. Show me the program where you're saying there's a Sizewell D, there's a Wilfer, we're building another one at Heysham. Show me where those numbers are, and I will say that is a great program. At the moment, I don't see that. Ed Miliband has been a very pro-nuclear for a long time, as far as I know. Tony Blair was as well. But the fact is, we have had the same government for 13 years. You can't really go back and blame people before. Most people were even concerned about climate change. That has happened in recent years. That's the time to have a program like they had in South Korea, which they then replicated in the UAE. It works. It is cheap. It meets our energy needs. It meets our carbon targets. It reduces air pollution globally. What's not to love? Yes, it costs money and investment, and it's longer term than renewables. But renewables, as I said, you have to replace them 2 or 3 times in that time, because 20 to 25 years they degrade and you have to replace them. A nuclear power plant will last 60 years. In some countries where they extend the lives of them, I think Finland's doing that. Yeah, Finland's doing that. They will last 80 years. I mean, that's very minimal resources and cost when you think on a timeline. And the thing is, politicians don't think on a long timeline. They think short term. And we desperately need long-term thinking to tackle climate change in all areas.
Well, that makes perfect sense. So people also aren't aware that Greta Thunberg, I believe, is now advocating for nuclear. Is that a true thing or not?
So what happened is she was asked directly about the phase out in Germany. So what happened is Germany started this phase out after Fukushima 2011. Then the energy crisis happened. Russia invaded Ukraine. And there was a moment where we all hoped that they'd backtrack. They only had 3 reactors left, but it's still better than nothing. It still means people retain their jobs. It's still better than coal. And so she was asked directly, what's your opinion on that? And she said, absolutely, they shouldn't shut them. Like, they're already there. Don't do it. So she has come out and said that. I haven't heard her say we should build more. I've only heard her say build more renewables. But some of that is just kind of social license, because there's so much backlash when you say, even still now, I'm not afraid of the backlash, and I've been through it, but I understand why people try to avoid it. And Germany did actually kind of succumb to that pressure, and they kept those reactors open a year later than intended. So what they said was, we need them this winter. But everybody else kind of went, what about next winter, which is the upcoming winter? So they closed them in April. But now they've just, in a couple of weeks ago, they reopened a coal-fired power station because they've realized they will not make it through the winter. They can build all the turbines and panels they want. They will not make it through the winter without some base load capacity. And they've really messed up their nuclear situation there.
Would you say they've overall reduced their emissions in Germany, or it's actually increased, despite the fact that they've gone down the renewables path?
The renewables have helped to decrease their emissions. If you look at the chart, there's no denying that has helped. But reducing the nuclear has increased emissions because it's most of the dependency has gone on to fossil fuels. Now they have mitigated, they have been quite clever in terms of reducing consumption, which we should do anyway. They're insulating buildings. They have had people rationing. Industry businesses have had to ration. But it's what you said earlier that actually led to a kind of deindustrialization, because what business wants to operate under those norms, and where the electricity is very expensive. It was expensive before the energy crisis. It was twice as expensive as in France before the energy crisis, because that cost for the renewables goes onto the consumer, it goes onto families. No one likes me saying it. You can have a look on my Substack. I wrote a whole article about it and it's fully referenced. That is what happened. It's happened in California. It's happened in New York. Every time they shut nuclear and replace it with renewables, there is an extra cost. It looks like they're cheap, but that cost goes to ordinary people. And that, again, because I care about working people, I don't think that's right. Personally, I think you should factor that cost in to something that will need to be replaced in a couple of decades in my lifetime. I'd rather have something that far outlives me, that will produce cheap electricity for people.
Yes, I mean, for me, from the UK's perspective, I don't think we can realistically recreate our industrial base and attract the likes of James Dyson, who, obviously is one of our top entrepreneurs, or Sir Jim Ratcliffe, for example. If they're not willing to put their factories here, then it's an absolute imperative, from my perspective, for the British industry to have that cheaper energy, competitive energy.
And this is what happened with Wilfer, that there were people coming in, but they said, you don't have a great history of building these things. They end up running over, which they do. That's not nuclear's fault. That's not technology's fault. That's our planning regulations, our protests slowing things down. Don't know if you've seen this in Sizewell. Sizewell was meant to be signed off ages ago. The RSPB and Friends of the Earth submitted paperwork, legal paperwork, to stop the building of it, saying it would harm the environment. There's already a massive document showing that they've done all this environmental work and that they're mitigating for it by building marshlands and all this stuff. They've measured every species. I mean, look, all of that work has been done. Basically, the legal process has slowed it up, and it still hasn't been signed off. So that costs money, puts off investors. Absolutely. I mean, why wouldn't you pull out at this point? Is it even going to ever get built? It means that workers just move away to find work other places because they don't know. There's uncertainty. That expertise disappears from the shore. The area becomes very deprived because, again, there's not other industry there really. And that's what happened in Wilfer. They pulled out and no one else has come forward. And we now need to incentivize people to come in and fund these programs. We also need to have some planning reform, that people shouldn't have that much of a say on, I mean, a lot of these people that I met that were protesting Sizewell, they don't even live there. One of them was there, he's a celebrity because he has a second home there and he didn't want the increased traffic. I'm just outraged. The working people are saying, we want the jobs for our children and for ourselves. And you've got this celebrity with a second home there, Bill Nye, who's been on a lot of their protests in Sizewell. So he gets a big crowd together of people who are against it. And most of them are rich Londoners. They have no idea what it's like to do that kind of work. And like I said, it is those hands that built that country, is those people that we need to push our weight behind. If we lose that expertise, we'll have no industry, even if people come in. Where will that expertise come from? I don't do that kind of manual labor. Do you? No, these people need jobs. Give them the job security, give them incentives to do it. And it benefits all of us. And it is about collaboration, and especially in terms of attracting investors, which that could be fixed. We'd need planning reform. We'd need a lot of change. I don't think Great British Nuclear goes far enough. Yes, I can say that because I'm independent. I'm not in the industry. I don't think it goes far enough at all.
And what do you anticipate for the going forward into the next Parliament, if anything? I mean, I was going to ask you, if you were the Secretary of State for Energy, what you would do, but I think you've pretty much answered that question.
Yeah.
But yes, so obviously heading into two major elections in the US and in the UK, what's going on in your head? What are you thinking? And also on the issue of, you gave a quote about blackouts are dangerous and energy is life.
We are rich. We are the richest people in the world. If you have access to lighting and heating, electricity and clean water and education and healthcare, as we do, we are the richest people in the world. We will get our energy needs met. We will just import it from somewhere else at whatever cost, right? That will just happen. And that cost will be a coal cost. It will be the cost of the people living in Poland or wherever we import that coal from in the winter. And that cost is exported onto the people that live there, who, again, most marginalized communities, cannot afford to move out of those areas. They talk about their windows being covered in soot. Their kids have high respiratory diseases. They have high levels of cancer. This is not exaggerated. We know this about coal. Don't live downwind of a coal-fired power station. These people live there. They work there because those are the jobs. And we export that cost. We'd never do it here. We'd never in a million years allow that here, quite rightly, but we export it. And I think that's disgusting, actually. We should know better. We are a wealthy country. I think it's time for a changing of the guard. I have tried to work with this government, but I've seen too much kind of, it's the previous government's fault. Come on, it's been 13 years. We could have decarbonized in that time. We could have decarbonized fully. We'd be a completely different country with a lot more wealth if we had built these power stations. We haven't. We have a ban on onshore wind. All we've really done was under Johnson, he built some wind turbines, not as many as he said he would, offshore wind turbines. But then even his wishes were Sunak's gone back on them, hasn't he? The net zero stuff has all been watered down. And I just think it's so disappointing when you then look at other nations, which are still emerging, a lot of the emerging nations, a lot of the emerging economies. Yes, they're burning a lot of coal, but they're also building more renewables and nuclear than we can imagine. I mean, China's building more renewables than anywhere in the world. They are looking ahead to a transition while we've just stalled.
Why do you think that has happened, in fact?
In this way, I'm positive. I'm optimistic because I think it's almost natural. We got too comfortable. We have everything. We don't have to think about manual labor anymore. We don't have to think about what it takes to build or where the resources come from. We have everything. I can just click on Amazon and tomorrow whatever I want will arrive in the post. This is true, right? Almost anything. That's capitalism. We've all grown up under this. And we've become complacent. We've forgotten where are the hands that build this. It used to be my parents. My parents worked in that generation. They were factory workers. But I don't know any factory workers now. Those factories, in fact, in Birmingham are all derelict now. That work all went overseas. So we don't see and understand the cost anymore. And actually, it was better when we had that industry here. And the reason for that is because our environmental standards are so high compared to these countries where we're getting these goods. Actually, it's better that if we were building here. But we don't want to. We see it as dirty and we've kind of moved forward. And okay, that's fine. We have other careers and it is hard labor. My parents had hard jobs. But we have forgotten our roots, I think, and all that innovation and progress and growth that got us here has kind of stalled. And I think naturally that would be temporary. I don't think that will be forever. And I think even the energy crisis did start a conversation, didn't it? Many people for the first time thinking about, oh, isn't it strange that every time I just flick a switch, I get lighting? Well, billions of people in the world have lived without this for a long time. They live with intermittent energy, if any at all. 2 billion people live in poverty and don't have any access to electricity like my parents.
Do you think that we've fallen into this in the UK unintentionally because we've been trying to do the right thing by adopting renewables, which under the UNFCCC and a lot of the European community has certainly been the preferred choice. But in fact, what's happened, and as you very rightly said, and I don't think people necessarily have made the connection, but I think, quite a few are aware, that it is the levies that are going directly on the consumer. So while you talk about us being privileged and rich, I don't think there's a lot of people in the British public right now with small to medium-sized businesses or elderly people who can't afford their electricity bills. And that is, to me, within the Sustainable Development Goals, I think actually alleviating fuel poverty is even above climate action. So could you just talk to that issue in the UK particularly, because I think people are really being held back by this high cost.
There's a real misconception, and you're right, and this is very deeply ingrained misconception. I'd say it's even worse than the anti-nuclearism, because that's been quite easy to combat in some ways because there's a lot of data on it. You have the conversations, people can go away and look up themselves, and people have been doing this for a long time. With renewables, there's a lot of some of the people I talk to, the way they talk about, oh, well, sun is an endless resource. It's like they don't understand these are huge infrastructure projects. And they're not just huge infrastructure. I mean, when you put wind turbines in the sea, this is a huge infrastructure project. There's loads of concrete, loads of resources. I'm not saying don't do it. But the fact is, it costs a lot of money And then it costs a lot of money to connect it to the grid. It's not like switching from coal to nuclear, which uses the existing grid, which is what they're doing in America. Very clever, very good Department of Energy report showing how easy it is actually to switch 80% of their coal-fired power stations over to nuclear, because a lot of the infrastructure's there, a lot of the workers can transition. Brilliant, huge report on that, big fan. Here, we're trying something completely new, and not acknowledging that cost that will go to ordinary working people. That has happened in so many places around the world. And, I find it kind of sad because I think it's a class issue, actually. So the movement I come from, which is, let's be honest, mostly middle class, I was in the Green Party years ago. So they're mostly middle class Green Party voters and councillors. They don't think about that cost. They own their own homes so they can have solar panels. They have money so they can buy an electric vehicle. They have money so they can have a heat pump instead of a gas boiler. I've spoken to people who have been fitting gas boilers their whole lives saying, what do we now do? This has put bread and butter on the table for our families, and we're not being retrained, and we're being told that the gas boilers are out. What do we do? And I'm like, wow, nobody's thinking about you in this transition. But that is what I keep coming back to, that the transition will happen because of these workers, not because the people who can afford all the things should have so much of a say in it, because actually there is a big class divide there. And that was the same in Extinction Rebellion. There's research on this. It was mostly a middle class movement. I was an unusual person in that group, someone with an immigrant background, so some understanding of poverty because my parents escaped it in India, and also with parents with very working class background, and then able to use that voice and say, there is a social justice issue here. People are talking more about social justice, but they don't apply it to renewables. They don't even care when I say, do you know that a lot of solar panels come out of Uyghur camps in China? That is not an exaggeration. There is a Guardian article, an investigative report found this is slave labor. I'm not saying don't build them, but we should not get them from there. And when I've asked people, can't we build them here? I've asked experts, can we not build them here? Oh no, it would make them too expensive. Okay, then can we question why they're so cheap? Is it because it's slave labor? Because come on, we can't right wrongs by making more wrongs. We have to look at the bigger picture. We have to look holistically at all of this. And there's very few people willing to do it. Do
you think the policy makers are coming more from the perspective of it being from an investor perspective in terms of how that looks as an industry, and as opposed to from a public interest perspective? I mean, that's why I think your role has been so key, because you're kind of like have been quite a lone voice that's been able to stand up for, and there are a few of you, to stay. This is actually the public interest case. It seems to be a gap there.
I would say a lot of it is social license. So like Ed Miliband's a good example, because I've heard him speak in favour of nuclear years ago. But if you look at his tweets now, it's all renewables. I know that he supports nuclear, but I also know that when Keir Starmer posted something about nuclear, out of interest, I went to see what the comments were. And there were so many antis. And I'm like, come on, this is just the old guard. They don't get a say in this. This is our children's future. And they are more concerned about climate change than nuclear. They don't care about nuclear, most of them. They didn't grow up with that fear relating it to weapons and the Cold War. They don't have that. They're afraid of climate change. They understand air pollution, and they do care about social justice issues. So if we talk about these things, which is what Emergency Reactor does when we go out and do events, they're very quickly sold on it. They just never heard about it before because it's never mentioned unless it's mentioned negatively. So we desperately need more people to start saying it. I do find it promising that, there was a point where a couple of years ago where the two main parties, Labour and Conservatives, were arguing, saying, we're going to build more nuclear. No, it's your fault we didn't build more. I thought that was quite promising that finally we got to that point. But that point was hard earned. And, I did have some role, however much, I don't know how much, I did have some role in getting us to that point where people would vocally come out and say, and it's now acceptable. But we now need to see that translate into action.
Yeah.
That's a bit where
the levelling up part, which I think you've been alluding to, the red walls constituencies, they feel really let down. I mean, what do you think the role of for example, nuclear power has in that region? And lastly, are you in favour at all of CCUS? It's been put into the Powering Up Britain policy document. What's your view on that?
Definitely those areas have been neglected. I think Sellafield's a really good example because that was a Labour seat for a long time. And when the person ran for that seat on an anti-nuclear ticket, he didn't win. And it went to Trudy Harrison, who is very pro nuclear, very open. I really like her approach. She's conservative, very pro-workers. Her whole history is a family that's been benefited. Obviously, Sellafield started out as it was problematic. They dumped atomic waste there from weapons, but now it's a very well-managed, safe facility with a lot of workers, and nuclear waste from the energy industry is stored there. So now it's brilliant, lots of workers. But that entire community was lost over that one issue. And as you would have seen at that SONA event that we went to at the House of Lords, Lord Cunningham of Fellings, he's from that area, and he's very pro the approach in Sellafield and making sure people have those jobs and that they get some representation. So I do think, and I've seen that Labour's running on that ticket, and they are saying we will build and we care about those jobs. And obviously they're in line with the unions who anyway, GMB, Prospect, they already support those programs because they support the workers, and there's none of that kind of middle class, we don't want this in our neighborhood because we don't like radiation. There's none of that going on. But there is that class divide, and I think in recent years that's worsened because of austerity and because people have gotten poorer and can't pay like you said, their electricity bills. It's gotten even more divided, and you definitely hear more from one side.
So are you saying that you're concerned that Keir Starmer's going to talk to the older generation's prejudices on nuclear, or is that a misunderstanding?
No, I think he's trying to speak to those people. He's trying to win those people back. I think there is a case for winning them back because
on the nuclear platform.
Yeah, a lot of people I speak to. So, for example, I did speak to this gas boiler fitter, and he said, look, I care about the environment, but I also care about supporting my family. I'm getting towards retirement now, so there's no retraining anyway. But even if there was retraining to fit heat pumps, I can't do it. What am I supposed to do? And I had no answer for him. I said, you know what? You're right. There's an entire generation of you that have contributed in this way to our economy, and you are now being told we have net zero, so go away. And all that's doing is dividing the people that want the action, who can afford it, and the people that, frankly, jobs and supporting their families is more important, which is fine and normal, but we cannot make decisions on one side without bringing them along, as we've seen happen in London with ULEZ, right?
I was going to bring up ULEZ.
We are not going to, we are not at a point now where we're arguing about climate change anymore. 10 years ago, we were. That's how much Extinction Rebellion did change the conversation. Before that, I was on my own, banging my drum. People were saying, it's not human cause, it's the sun. That's how ridiculous it was. Now, broad consensus, everybody accepts that climate change is human driven. We need to do something about it. The next step now, the barrier is the climate action itself. Will people accept the actual action? What we've just seen happen in London, and even in my area with the low traffic neighborhoods, which is a very small thing here, the protests against it have been.
So what's your view on ULEZ? Because I want to end on the whole issue of you talked about missed opportunity. And for me, I do see, while we have a big deficit in terms of our energy security gap, given that we've been focusing on renewables, that there's this huge opportunity for training and for inspiring. This is your role, is to help inspire the next generation to understand the misconceptions and to really get excited about this opportunity and have a kind of not just a nuclear revival, but in a way a clean industrial revival is how I see it. And I think you've got a really key role to play in that.
So ULEZ, the thing is, a lot of these measures are not going to be popular. Like, we need to accept that. That is not about climate change or net zero. Remember the smoking ban? I remember the smoking ban. Can't smoke indoors anymore. Practically riots on the street. Everybody's angry. Now, we wouldn't go back. The polls show that almost all Britons voted in this poll saying we wouldn't want to go back. Why would you want to eat in a restaurant with someone smoking there? But at the time, the resistance. Now look, this is why we're in a democracy, and you and I do not make these decisions individually. We choose people to make these decisions for us. And that's hopefully how a functioning democracy works. I'm not saying there's not some things to iron out there that might be going on now, but essentially we need those people to come in, look at the numbers, what needs to be done. Okay, lots of people are being impacted by passive smoking. We're going to make a difficult decision, but it will save lives. And it has done, and everybody's forgotten about it. Carrier bag ban. It wasn't a ban, but that's what they called it. Loads of protests. Do you remember that? Absolute outrage. How dare they take our bags? Everybody adjusted. We are very adaptable people. It's completely fine. Again, reduced use of plastic bags. Most people now just carry cloth bags with them. It's okay. The same thing is going to happen with all of these things. What I really hope is that the politicians stick with it. instead of backtracking because of the backlash. The backlash is going to happen no matter what the change is. And there is the ULEZ and low traffic neighborhoods are not just something that's been plucked out of the sky. There are two options. One, you tell people that they can't drive. No, we're never going to do that. We shouldn't do that. I'm a non-driver, but let's not be authoritarian about this. Some people would advocate for it. Nope, I've never been in that camp. The other option is to reduce air pollution in specific areas by putting in congestion charges or making it more difficult to drive there, yes. Or making it easier to cycle there. That's a good incentive, making it easier to walk there safely with children. That's what they've done here. In my neighborhood, there's a couple of roads with above legal limits of air pollution. There are children that live on the road. I live right by a primary school. My daughter goes there. They put in this trial period of 8 months where they shut those roads. They consulted the residents. They agree. I mean, the residents love it because the kids can play out on the street now and they're cycling everywhere. But the people, a lot of the rest of the people who now have to avoid those roads, huge protests. I mean, scary protests that the councillors have had death threats. The people that have voted in these changes have like really been on the brunt of it, which shocked me because I'm just in a little city in Exeter. That ULEZ thing is not just London. This is happening everywhere. And it's even being used, I think, as this wedge issue where people are saying, you know, this is what this group is kind of saying is they're using it to control. And it's not about control or anything. It's literally just to bring down the air pollution. In 8 months, they'll have the data because they're measuring it. If it shows it's worked, they'll keep it. If the trial fails, we won't do it. But it will work because what happens is over time, people will drive less. People will realize they can cycle or walk those routes instead. And yes, some of the driving will still happen, but it's distributed in other areas, which just keeps it below legal limits. The limits are there because it's so dangerous when it's so high. It's a no-brainer to me. I understand that people are upset about it. I don't know what else to suggest. We are not getting people out of cars, right? That's not happening. We are transitioning to electric vehicles. That's really good. That will reduce the air pollution. It's incremental changes all the way.
And we also know that the EV charging infrastructure has to be baseload power from nuclear because otherwise you've got a mixed energy, message, haven't you? If you're deriving it from
needs to be,
natural gas, it's an issue.
It needs to be joined up. Yeah, but it's still an incremental improvement on gas and diesel. And we've always done that. We've become more fuel efficient. We've become more, often these things are incremental. It's not a huge thing overnight.
So the last point I would make is, because we're wrapping up soon, but is this point leading on to from what you just said about the ULEZ and the resistance against net zero, which obviously, I suppose traditionally coming from the right is becoming increasingly unpopular as a overall policy agenda. To me, and I think I pressed on it a bit about the policy perhaps coming from the investor perspective and not enough from the public interest consumer levy perspective. How can we bring people with us in terms of the net zero agenda with regards to clean energy, which is essentially achieving sustainable energy for all and not just profits for the investors? Because it seems that at the moment it's the consumer that's getting all the downside and they're not stakeholders in this. And that might lead on to that skills and training, issue just to
I think we just need to incentivize. We need to incentivize. If our public transport is so degraded, and it is, I think if you don't travel a lot, you don't realize. But if you go to Germany or France and it just works and it's on time and it's cheap, you realize, or Japan, you realize we are really not putting money into this. In fact, we don't even pay the workers well, do we? Which is why they keep striking. And there's a shortage of workers because a lot of them suffered during the pandemic. We lost workers, didn't we? Because they were key workers.
So are you saying basically we need to put a massive investment into our infrastructure, into cheaper energy, jobs, training?
Absolutely. And if you want people out of cars, no one wants to be told that they have to get out of their car. But if you make it cheap and easy for them to use public transport, they will use it. Everybody will always do what's cheaper and easier. And at the moment, it is cheaper and easier to drive. And I say that as someone that doesn't drive. And the time before that London trip, I went up to Liverpool and I had... it was the day that the Swindon line flooded and I got stranded in Bristol again. I got 1 hour north and I went to the ticket lady and I said, how can I get to this thing in Liverpool? I have a job to do. I have to give a talk there. I'm giving a lecture. This is really important. And she said, I'll tell you now that if you get on any train up there, you will be stranded. And I said, well, I literally cannot move.
So with that note, going into the election year, what would you be recommending to the leading the emerging leading candidate both in the US and the UK, what would be
complete
your
overhaul
big
of public
message?
transport again? And in America, in America, in a way. So I mean, obviously, America's a large country. Some countries like some states like Boston actually have really good public transport. A lot of the South, where I've spent time, has nothing at all. People have to be able to drive right from when they're like 16. But in a way, that's good because they could build this infrastructure from scratch. The problem we have is that we can't build it from scratch. It was not all destroyed and bombed in the war. So we're stuck with these old infrastructure, and a lot of money needs to be put in upgrading those lines and even moving those lines in. For example, down here in Devon, a lot of them are coastal and they every time there's a storm, they just get flooded. They have to be completely moved. And I know that it's really expensive, but none of this transition will be cheap. The only thing that I would stress is that cost cannot go to the ordinary working person. That's just, you are not going to take people with you. It needs to be that we're making cheap and convenient options in all of these areas that people understand. In the UAE, they did a brilliant campaign on this. When they were building Baraka, they did a lot of information events, informative events, and sent out literature to people to explain to them, this will bring down your bills. And it has done. So then they have a 90% pro-nuclear society. Well, that's why. That's what they care about. You need to talk to people where they're at and not, up here. And actually, in a way, net zero is kind of up here. Net zero came from Extinction Rebellion. It came from middle-class activists who think, oh, that's a nice, lovely term. For a lot of people now, that term is a threat because they think it's a threat to their jobs.
So you don't think net zero necessarily means economic decline?
No, of course not. I mean, look at, South Korea's economy is booming. The UAE is doing really well. They are meeting the targets, but they're building a lot of nuclear. I mean, that it keeps coming back to that. And that's why I keep banging on about it. No one's paying me to I don't work for the industry, but it's what the research keeps telling me. And it's almost sad to me that we're not doing it, because all you need is one leader, like, all right, Pierre Mesmer, French president, 80s, his oil crisis. It wasn't about climate change, it was an oil crisis. And there was a saying in France at the time, we do not have oil, but we have ideas. And his idea was, let's build a nuclear program that will rival anyone else in the world. They did it. Loads of workers, right? Loads of apprenticeships, loads of expertise, loads of nuclear power plants, and they decarbonized in the 80s before I was born. And I'm sitting here saying, what is my country doing? Because I feel like we were the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution and we've forgotten our roots.
Oh, that's just wonderful. Well, that's a perfect way to end. Thank you so much, Xeon Lights. It was an absolute pleasure to go through that whole journey of your own conversion and the ideas you want to put forward as we head towards 2030 and 2050. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I'd like you to come back on to the Safer, Cleaner Planet series. And after we've got to the point of the next Parliament to discuss what's happening next. So that'd be
Brilliant.
great. All right,
so
brilliant,
much.
Xeon. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.